Well, good afternoon, everyone. I see 3 o'clock here on my clock. We're going to get started. My name is Mike Smulligan. I'm a forester with the Michigan Department of Natural Resources. I'm also the program chair for the Michigan Society of American Foresters, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this webinar. I'm going to share my screen and go over a couple of introductory matters as we get going. Give folks some time to log on to the webinar before we pass it over to our speakers. Share slides real quick. So again, welcome to the first of 5 webinars on white oak. And today we're going to be learning about oak ecology and silviculture with Greg Nowacki with U.S. Forest Service ecologist, and Stacy Clark and Callie Schweitzer, also with the U.S. Forest Service as research foresters. So I'm excited to hear from those folks this afternoon, but we're going to be coming back again for the first Wednesday of the next 4 months also to learn more about white oak, and you can see the upcoming webinars there. And this is all part of the National White Oak Initiative, where foresters and others have realized that we have a lot of mature white oak here in the central and eastern United States, but we're not seeing a lot of reproduction and young oaks, moving in to replace those older white oaks. And so the American Forest Foundation and other partners started the White Oak Initiative back in 2017. And we'd like to acknowledge generous funding from the U.S. Department of Agriculture Forest Service through several landscape scale restoration grants. And the White Oak Initiative is truly a national project with partners throughout the eastern and central United States, lots of government agencies, universities, forest products companies, landowners, foresters. It's really a big coalition, and you can learn more about it at the whiteoakinitiative.org. Here in Michigan, there's a dozen or so partners that are working with the American Forest Foundation and the U.S. Forest Service to try to bring home some of these concepts and lessons from the National White Oak Initiative here in Michigan. And so you can see some of our partners here, my employer, the Michigan Department of Natural Resources, the Society of American Foresters, MSU Extension, conservation districts, the Turkey Federation, Prescribed Fire, lots of excellent partners, and we want to acknowledge funding from the American Forest Foundation and U.S. Forest Service for this webinar and the other efforts that these partners are doing here in Michigan. Again, the Michigan Society of American Foresters is the host for this webinar series. And SAF offers professional networking and continual improvement and leadership and ethics and service to society. And we've got 340 foresters in Michigan that are members of the Society of American Foresters. And as a little perk for Michigan SAF members, we're going to be purchasing a bunch of copies of the Managing Oak Forest in the Eastern United States. And so Michigan SAF members that are participating will be eligible for a free copy of that book. All foresters, whether you're in Michigan or other states, are eligible for 1.5 continuing forestry education credits for each of these webinars. And I will be submitting the participant list directly to National Society of American Foresters. So you don't need to follow up with me or anyone else if you're a forester looking for a 1.5 CFEs. For folks that are not able to join us live today, we are recording the webinar. And we will make those recordings available at michigansaf.org. Before I hand it over to our speakers, I just couldn't resist as a forester taking a look at some of the data here in the state of Michigan. The speakers today are going to be talking about oak at a regional scale, but I got a hold of Scott Pugh with the U.S. Forest Service, who works with the Forest Inventory and Analysis, and got some text and some data from Scott that's going to be coming out soon in the 2019 version of the Forests of Michigan report from the Forest Service. And the trends that we're seeing across the central and eastern United States are also happening here in Michigan, where we've got abundant oak forests that are mature. And we're not seeing a lot of seedlings moving into the sapling and the pole timber sizes. And so we're at a point here in Michigan where we need to start making some decisions. If we want to maintain the amount of oak on the landscape that we've got now, we need to start thinking about different approaches to management in order to increase oak regeneration and maintain the oak that we want to have here in Michigan. You can see that our white oak saplings are declining here in Michigan. And this is a cause for concern and an opportunity to take a look at how we manage our oak forests if we want to maintain oak on the landscape here in Michigan. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I'm going to pass things over to our first speaker, Greg Nowacki with the U.S. Forest Service. And Greg's going to set the stage for us here so we can learn more about oak ecology. So Greg, thank you very much.
All righty. First of all, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. I can see your presentation. You're in full screen mode, so take it away, and the floor is yours, Greg.
All right. Thanks, Mike, and the Michigan Society of American Foresters for the invite to deliver presentation. It's entitled Oak Ecology, Fire Relations, and Mesification. Again, my name is Greg Nowacki. I'm the regional ecologist with the U.S. Forest Service, located at the Eastern Regional Office in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. So without any further ado, the objectives of this particular presentation is to step through really the basics of oak ecology and in documenting the historical relations between oak and fire, relate compositional and structural changes over to land use change and widespread fire suppression. Of course, we have to touch on the mesification concept. And lastly, demonstrate the need of thinning and prescribed burning in order to maintain our oak resource on the landscape. So exactly what is the problem? And Mike, you touched on it. It's really a lack of oak regeneration that's taking place out on our landscape and really overall demise of our oak ecosystems, which is really problematic. Probably best to start at the beginning, and we can look back to pre-settlement times. I've just so that folks know out there in the audience, I've included pine in this presentation. Both oak and pine are related in where they occur in habitats, very similar relations to fire. So it just makes sense to deal with both of these genera. But based on the information we have, it seems like our oak and oak pine systems of the past were much more open. They're much more woodland-ish in nature. We can turn to a variety of witness tree data sets that really document the fact that tree densities had a tendency of being on the low side. Of course, with that, diameters of these forests tended to be on the higher side, and coupled together, density and diameter giving you basal area, BAs tended to be on the lower side. Diameter distributions of pre-settlement oak-dominated ecosystems was dependent upon the nature of the structure of the system itself. If you're dealing more with a forested ecosystem, it probably was more quasi-even, maybe patch dynamics going on, where you had patches of small trees, medium-sized trees, and large trees in a forested landscape. When you're dealing with open woodlands and savannas, definitely you're dealing with a J-shaped curve. So you had a lot of individuals in the large diameter class and very few in the smaller size classes. Now, with these more open woodland conditions, of course, we had highlight conditions penetrating down to the forest floor. And with this, we had a great variety, a robust variety, a diversity of ground flora. Many grasses occurring in these locations, oftentimes big blue stem, little blue stem, Indian grass, a whole contingent of flowering forbs and composites and asters and things such as that. And of course, we had a shrub component affiliated with these understories, blueberries, ericaceous shrubs, huckleberries, elderberries, hazelnuts, things such as that. So what I do want to emphasize is these ecosystems were incredibly rich when you looked into this understory layer. And from Gilliam 2007, we see that greater than 80% of a total plant richness comes from the ground floor layer. So this is how these ecosystems were in the past, by and large. Well, things changed over time. We had European settlement and we had the Great Cutover. It varied in when it took place, of course, east to west, early 1800s to around 1900 itself. With that harvesting, we had smaller individuals that were scattered in this location with oaks, and again, I'm touching on pines as well. One thing that was interesting is that after the Great Cutover, oftentimes there is a series of burnovers that took place, and they really impacted the regeneration of pine in particular. Why is that? Is pine doesn't have the ability to sprout. There are some exceptions out there, shortleaf pine and pitch pine being two species that do have some ability to resprout, but the pine really got hammered. And this is well documented when we look at pre-settlement witness tree records and compare those to current conditions, by which this dual punch of cutting followed by burning really had a negative effect on pine component, particularly eastern white pine, red pine, and jack pine. But for the oaks, it really wasn't a big deal, these burns. And why is that? Is because they have the ability to sprout. So whether the individuals sprouted from stumps, top killed seedlings and saplings, that's indeed what they did. And we had forest recovery from there. So a lot of sprouting via that method of regeneration. There also was some seed-based regeneration. And if you had some pines that were left in the system, bearing pines, you had that component coming back, but oftentimes at a much more extent. These forests grew, and these are the conditions that we see today. But those conditions are very different when looking back in time at what was here in pre-settlement times. This is information coming from a variety of studies throughout the Midwest. Within a column, we have two columns of numbers. The first one pertaining to pre-settlement conditions, the second column relating to present day. If we look at Frailish's work in southern Illinois, he's looking at sites across the environmental gradient from terrace, southern slopes, northern slopes, and ridge tops. But we see this profound change in tree density over time from pre-settlement to, again, present day conditions. And we see that in other studies as well. Tree diameter, not surprisingly, average tree diameter was reduced in size. This is, again, not surprisingly because of the Great Cutover, and trees had to regenerate, forming our second growth and tertiary growth forests. These two parameters, again, give you basal area. And what we have seen is an increase in basal area over time in these sites. And we went from these quasi-even or J-shaped curves to a strongly inverse J-shaped curve, where we have tons and tons of small diametered individuals, a good amount of medium-sized individuals, and not so many in the large class. So as summary, making the comparison from witness tree databases to FIA databases of today and other sources of information, this is the take-home messages. One is this tremendous increase in tree density, anywhere from 2 to 10-fold. Again, we have this decrease in average tree diameter, not surprising. We've seen diameter reductions of anywhere from 10 to 20 centimeter on average. These two metrics coupled together give you basal area, and we've seen an increase of basal area averaging about 7 square meters per hectare. And again, this is mainly driven by this tree component, particularly small trees. And this diameter distribution shift from quasi-even and J-shaped to strongly inverse J-shaped today, chock full with small trees. So under today's low light conditions, what's going on? Well, once you have canopy, close canopy cover conditions occurring, the first life form basically to wink off are the grasses. They tend to be very shade intolerant. This is well documented by Dr. Roger Anderson from Illinois State University. So grasses are first to go. Eventually, you'll see a reduction in forbs, oftentimes to the point of elimination. And lastly, the shrubs die off. They have the greatest amount of energy in their root systems, hence they're the last ones to wink out in this situation, again, under low light. And oftentimes this is what we're left with, is a bed of leaves. I tell people all the time from my exploits from southern Minnesota and Wisconsin across Indiana, Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, into southern New England, south through the Carolinas, across again through Kentucky, Tennessee, into the Ozarks and Ouachitas. This is a recurring theme. And it's really a head scratcher. You know, here we have forests, but yet we don't have this contingent of ground flora affiliated with that. You know, that doesn't seem right from an ecological standpoint. Well, I think we can explain it, and it's because these systems were not necessarily closed canopy forests in the past, or closed canopy forests that now have these multiple layers that have set up complements of mixed mesophytic species. So under today's low light conditions, getting to the tree component specifically, the oaks and pines tend to be very shade tolerant. I think white oak is probably the most tolerant of the oaks by and large, but even that, they're probably only intermediate in nature. And we've seen these two genera cease regenerating under these conditions. However, we've seen a huge pulse of shade tolerant competitors, particularly maples, beech, basswood, things such as that, that do regenerate prolifically. And not only do they regenerate prolifically, but they're successfully able to recruit under these conditions. And this, my friends, is what we refer to as mesophication. So what's driving mesophication? I just love this picture. Here we have a big wolf tree and oak.
Greg, we lost you on the audio. Are you still
course.
out there?
I am.
Ah, beautiful. All right, now you're back going. Go for it.
Okay, so there was a interruption, I take it. So anyway, there's various factors that have been pointed to regarding mesophication: climate change, oak overbrowsing by deer, fire suppression, of course. Sorry about that delay there, folks. And even the poor old passenger pigeon has been implicated, its extinction on why we have changed conditions today. But when you look at these factors and others, there's really one that reigns supreme, and that's fire suppression. This basically explains in totality why we have this dramatic transition as of fights. Just as a side, it's kind of interesting that I see ecologists oftentimes focus on ancillary factors when trying to explain what's going on, a particularly ecological phenomenon. And that's part of our DNA, I think. Unfortunately, when we try to wrangle up all these factors and put them into a multivariate equation, we lose those connections with land managers who oftentimes like things packaged a little bit more succinctly. And I think this indeed is the case. This one is pretty closely tied to fire suppression. And the ancillary factors, they're contributing, sure, but this is the biggie. We can turn to numbers that have been generated from the Washington office. This is area burned in the eastern United States. You can draw a line from western Minnesota down to Louisiana and all those states eastward. And these are the numbers spanning from the 1930s to the 1980s. We can see back in the 30s, we were averaging around 10 million hectares of acres burned annually. We see this precipitous decline in the 1940s and 50s, flatlined thereafter around a million hectares occurring. So this is pretty dramatic, what has happened over a very short period of time. And we think that a series of fire suppression policies coupled with the post-World War II deployment deployment of men and material to fight fires was very effective. As a matter of fact, look at how the fires have decreased within a decade. Once in, again, this men and material to fight fires, it's pretty. So a dramatic change in fire regimes, dramatic decrease in overall fire across the entire eastern United States. There's a reciprocal relationship between fire importance and the concept of mesification. Looking back in time, pre-settlement conditions or conditions immediately after the Great Cutover. Again, we are dealing more open woodland type of situations, oak and pine. Highlight conditions to the forest floor, a robust understory of forbs, grasses, and shrubs. Something happened along the way to paradise here. As the numbers shown in the earlier graph, we had severe fire suppression taking place in the 1950s. We have tree stands going from these more open woodland conditions to closed canopy, and with that increased shade. And all at once, we saw these little fire sensitive, the mint trees that you see in the understory here, these fire sensitive shade tolerant mesophytes starting to regenerate and recruit on all these sites. By the time the early 2000s rolled around, heading into today, now we have a really dramatic increase of shade tolerant mesophytic trees, and that's only aiding to the problem because they're high leaf area index, shading these areas profusely. As a matter of fact, when you look at the amount of sunshine hitting the overstories and then you look in the understory, maybe only 2 to 3% of ambient light is actually making it down to the forest floors. So heavy duty shading in these current conditions. And for the foreseeable future, if things don't change, what we're now seeing is decreased flammability of these areas due to the mesophytic litter. Tends to be flaccid, it tends to be wet, it tends to plaster itself on forest floors, making for fuel beds. And also the conditions of increasing coolness and humidness because of these multi-layers that have set up at this time in the severe shading taking place. Time for a little ecophysiology lesson. Indeed, oak is a fire and drought tolerant genus, and it possesses various adaptations. First and foremost is thick bark. So as it ages, it increases its bark thickness, and we think this is due in part to protect boles from fire, surface fire. If it happens to be injured by fire, it's a very able compartmentalizer, minimizing that wound within the bole. It heals over wounds very rapidly. The wood itself tends to be very rot resistant, aiding to its tensile strength. Very aggressive sprouter. We've touched on this before, and we think this in part is a fire-based reproductive strategy. Opportunistic, it favors areas of disturbance. It needs, again, highlight conditions to not only regenerate, but to recruit successfully. And interesting enough, it produces fuels that promote fire. We can turn to Macmillan, 1988, and look at coarse woody debris decay rates between oak and hickory, which are basically akin to one another in this regard. Compare that to mesophyte. And what we see is that both oak and hickory, again, are similar. The woody debris that they create decays very slowly compared to these mesophytic species such as beech and maple. So this leads to a stockpiling, if you will, of woody debris that occurs in oak-dominated ecosystems versus mixed mesophytic forests. Kind of a similar phenomenon if we look at leaf differences between oak and hickory and mesophytic plants. Oaks tend to produce leaves that are thick, they're rigid, they have a strong propensity of curling upon themselves upon leaf drop, leaving nice aerated conditions on the forest floor. And they also have a strong propensity of repelling water. So these are conditions that are very favorable, of course, to fire. Contrast that with mesophytic leaves. They tend to be thin, flaccid. Upon senescence and falling to the forest floor, They tend to retain their moisture, and they tend to plaster themselves on the forest floor, making for very little air pockets affiliated with that type of litter layer, and making for a very poor fuel bed for fire. And so is it any wonder why ecosystems that were dominated by oak and hickory in the past burned, and those dominated by mesophytes largely did not? So with that said, just touching on oak's drought tolerance, it's very efficient with its water usage. It has tap roots that allow it to exploit deep water in the soilscape itself. It has a fantastic ability to osmotically adjust, changing its solute concentrations to extract water from very dry soils. And lastly, it has these xeromorphic leaves that we just spoke to, which minimizes water loss. Specifically, it has a very thick cuticle layer that aids in that regard. So based on the past, based on the ecophysiology of oak, we definitely know that prescribed burning is needed for its management, but it really isn't enough for the restoration of these pyrogenic ecosystems. We can turn to Carter et al.'s work, 2015 at the Morton Arboretums, and what they found that is that after 20 years of prescribed annual burning, again, 20 years worth of annual burning, combined with story thinning, this has failed to produce the conditions necessary for oak recruitment. Isn't that making a statement? You can look at oak seedlings. The relative density is not even hitting 2% of the seedlings in this particular case. This is the range immediately below. And for oak saplings, it's even worse. Yeah, it's not even hitting 0.5% there, relative density. This, my friends, is really a illustration of the sapling bottleneck, the inability to oak to recruit upwards into the sapling stage, which it needs to be in if there's an overstory disturbance and where they can capture that growing space. And what's limiting here, obviously, is they're doing burning treatments, but there's still not enough light penetrating down to the forest floor to really encourage oak regeneration. So this really highlights the need that you need to manage overstories if you want oak to regenerate and recruit. So what shall we do? This is today's conditions with oak dominating overstories in this mixed mesophytic layer occurring in the midstory and understory layer. So definitely we want to thin overstories, perhaps down to 50% basal area or so, canopy cover, however you want to couch it. When thinning, of course, you want to discriminate against those competing species, maples, beeches, basswoods, whatever it might be. You want to follow that up with a burn, and zoinks, it doesn't work. You still have this mint green colored trees, these mesophytes that have simply taken over doing these two treatments. Well, we are dealing with two situations here. One is that these mesophytes have grown to such a size now, in the mid-size range, anywhere from 6-7 inches dBH or so, by which a single fire won't kill them. It might damage their lower bowl a little bit, but it's not going to kill them. And for those individuals that are smaller, where you have top kill, they have an ability to resprout as well, similar to oak. Particularly red maple. That is really a bugaboo, and all of you are probably cognizant of that. You know, top kill one of them, those stems with fire, and you end up with 50 the next year, right? So again, thinning is needed in the overstory, and you need to do multiple burns in the understory, depleting the mesophytic source. And once you have these mesophytes largely eliminated, basically what you want to do is wait for a mast year of oak. At that time, you stop burning, and you allow those acorns to sprout into seedlings, and seedlings to saplings, and off you have a regenerating oak stand. Now, for timber management, this is basically wash, rinse, and repeat, right? What I've served up here, once you get into maturity and it's time to recruit these stands again, you can start with a shelter wood cut or a seed tree, emulating those thins that I just spoke to. Again, you can put in a burning regimen to knock back mesophytic component, which undoubtedly has developed over time, and then wait for a mast year and off you go, and you can cycle through this. But note that you're dealing with a closed canopy forested condition, and it takes place rather rapidly after 5 to 10 years, even though you're dealing with a young, small size stand. It's still casting a lot of shade to the understory, and this is truly not ecosystem restoration as we know it. So what you want to do in that case, the latter, is you want to try to maintain open conditions, of course, through burning. And then over long periods of time, you want to pull fire from those areas to allow pulses of regeneration. And when you get that pulse, you hold fire back for a 10, 12-year period, allowing it to recruit into larger sizes, allowing it to armor itself against fire. And at that time, you can bring fire back to that ecosystem. So you're dealing with really a bifurcation here. One way going for timber management and basically operating within these closed canopy forest conditions versus what you want to try to strive for ecosystem restoration which is a much more open ecosystem. Now, oftentimes these two ways of land management are cast against one another, right? That they're mutually exclusive. And I want to argue against that because when you're dealing with a larger landscape, that's encompassing thousands of acres, and we have that in the federal government, at the state government with state foresters and wildlife areas, and even NGOs that have larger land bases. You need to really integrate both of these pathways. So your timber management is the moneymaker, right? This is where we're going to generate the proceeds by which we can convey to ecosystem restoration, because that is largely a money sink. You're going to have to be going into these areas, anywhere from 3, 5, 7 years and getting prescribed burning back on these landscapes to maintain their openness, right? To maintain those woodland conditions that you want, to maintain higher light conditions to the understory, to encourage that wonderful array of ground flora. So instead of casting this again as a zero-sum game, we should be understanding that these two systems can complement each other in the manner I just explained. Now, I think ecologists have had a problem over a long period of time explaining what we need regarding these more open woodland type of conditions. And I think John Cabrick, Bryce Hamberry, and Dan Day have hit the jackpot because they have stepped into the forestry realm using one of the most important principles there is in forestry and silviculture, and that is stocking guides. And historically, foresters and silviculturists, I have several degrees in forestry have always strived to obtain that A line, right? Striving for maximum sustainable yield, those concepts. And for selection harvesting, when it bumped up to the A line, we would trim back perhaps down to the B line thereabout, and we'd cycle through here. For oak ecosystems, even H management oftentimes was used. So either you had clear cut seed tree or shelterwood methods. The latter two would bump you down into this category. And eventually, once you had a regeneration of oak, those trees would be harvested. But we never really had a slot for how do you manage closed woodlands. Woodlands basically are those that are more or less closed canopy, but there's no midstory or understory. Open woodland definitely has large gaps. You're dealing with canopy closures from 20 to 60% or so, again, lacking a midstory and understory. Savanna conditions are really more prairie-like in nature, with just a few scattered trees, just tens of trees per acre at best. But now we have a method to convey ecologically what we need to foresters and silviculturists using this grand illustration right here. And I can go to say that this is probably the most important slide in my slide deck right here. It wasn't generated from me, it was generated from my Northern Research Station colleagues. So I want to tip my hat to them. So this is a very good way of conveying the playing fields of ecosystem restoration if you want a closed woodland, if you want to open woodland, or if you want a savanna condition, and how we can turn to foresters and silviculturists to obtain those conditions and how to maintain them through prescribed burning and periodic thinning if need be. And so this is the play yard right here for oak ecosystem restoration. And again, this runs counter to what we have learned in college. I'm a critter from back in the 1980s when I went to college. Always taught about the A line, always taught about maximum sustained yield. This flies in the face of that, but that's okay, because these are a type of structures that we would like to see in the landscape, at least from a restoration standpoint. Now, stepping through this presentation, the demise of oak ecosystems, how they're converting over to the shade tolerant mesophytes. It's kind of downer information, isn't it? So I like to kind of end with a success story. And I always, this wonderful study, the Mark Twain National Forest, the Western Star Oak Flatwoods. On the left-hand side, we have an untreated stand, and on the right-hand side, it's treated through thinning and burning. Regarding our untreated stand, kind of the typical present-day conditions, we have this continuous canopy, high tree density, a shaded understory, a deep popper ground flora. Matter of fact, this is more robust than I normally see. Again, getting back to what I shared earlier, normally I'm just kicking through leaves, and the plants I find are foreign, right? NNIS, multiflora rose and buckthorn, things like that. And because fire is not part of these ecosystems, it has accumulated a rather deep leaf litter layer. Here in our treated stand, treated with thinning and 5 burns over a 15-year period, what has happened? You have this open canopy. The tree densities are back to historic levels. Again, we have now highlight or mid-light conditions to the forest floor. You can see what has exploded here in the ground flora. So we now have a robust and diverse ground flora layer again. You can get oak regeneration back on this site again by holding fire off after a mast year and going through that pathway that I explained previously. And a negligible leaf litter layer, again, because of the fact that we're burning. So success stories do exist out there. This is one of many. And I just want to encourage those on the audience that this does exist, this can be done. So in summary, we've learned that oak is indeed a pyrogenic, a fire-dependent genus based on its tree life histories and physiological characteristics. Fire formerly played a very significant role throughout the eastern United States, and we're currently burning only a fraction of what historically burned. I had additional slide deck on this one, but I ran out of time, so I need to roll on. Fire suppression efforts over the last century have been extremely effective to the detriment of our fire-dependent plant communities, particularly the ground flora layer. Fire suppression has led to this cascading effects, changing these open land systems to closed canopy forests, and then allowing fire-sensitive shade-tolerant species to prosper, especially maples, at the expense of oaks. Both prescribed burning and thinning are needed in order to maintain our oak ecosystems. Please use timber management receipts to generate funds needed for long-term oak ecosystem restoration. And again, I just want to point out the fact that these two concepts are not mutually exclusive. And this is not a zero-sum game. We can manage some of our forests for timber, and those proceeds can in turn be shuttled over for ecosystem restoration needs. And there's a lot of time, people, and energy that needs to go into prescribed burning of these ecosystems, particularly at their frequency. And barriers, just to point out, are many regarding prescribed burning. We all know that. And the problem here is that the opportunities for restoring our pyrogenic ecosystems are definitely waning. So the time is now. So with that, I conclude my presentation. I hope you found it instructive. If you have any questions that I can't answer today, please zap me an email and I can get back to you. I want to end it with this quotation that I find quite remarkable. Restoration uses the past not as a goal, but as a reference point for the future. if we seek to recreate the temperate forest, tall grass, savannas, or desert communities of centuries past, it is not to turn back the evolutionarily clock, but to set it ticking again. With that, back to you, Mike.
Greg, thank you very much. Hey, we've got 5 minutes here for some time for questions. So we've got several questions already in the Q&A box there. I would encourage participants to type in more questions. But Greg, let me give you this first question there. That chart that you showed of the historic burned area in the eastern United States was really interesting. And the question here is that peak back in the 30s, was that indicative of pre-settlement conditions, or was there kind of a peak in fire as a result of the logging era and a lot of the slash being burnt over after the 1800s?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I would say it was more indicative of pre-settlement burning than what is occurring today. What is the difference between what I showed back in the 1930s versus pre-settlement? That is questionable. We just do know, based on, again, the ecophysiology of oak and the type of ecosystems that occurred here, stand densities, the openness, that fire must have been very frequent in burning over large expanses in the eastern United States. Otherwise, many of our oak forests would have been very different. They would have been mixed mesophytic forests. So I suspect that peak in the 30s is probably more indicative of what was taking place in pre-settlement times. Is it exact? No.
Sure, thank you. Got another question here for you about leaf litter in the Maple Beach forests. And as those Maple Beach leaves are decomposing, does that affect the pH of the soil? And does that have positive or negative impacts on oak regeneration?
That's an interesting question, and that's one that's a little out of my wheelhouse right here. Of course, trees generate foliage that will in turn impact soil pH. Some have a greater effect than others. I know for maples, sugar maple in particular, tends to be a calciphile, calcium-loving tree. So one would think that that would be cycling more cations into the leaf litter layer itself upon leaf drop, and that it might have a positive effect. Well, I don't know if to call it positive, but it would lessen the acidity of forest floors, right? Because you're cycling these cations into it. How it mixes into this oak to maple transfer, I don't know exactly. I would say it probably would favor mesophytes because they tend to be more linked into more fertile type of conditions, particularly against sugar maple. So that too might be part of this mesification process that I have neglected to address in the past. So good question.
Okay, great. Thanks. Got another question for you here. This is regarding the timing, the adding fire to the system and then holding off fire for some oak regeneration, and encouraging after a good mast year to withhold fire for the acorns to germinate and so forth. Let's see. So given a decade of oak, pine, hickory litter following would create an intense burn, is it assumed that the bark of the seedlings and the other oak trees would be fire resistant at the point when you would put fire back into that system?
Yeah, regarding that, first of all, you have to be careful when you bring fire back into these ecosystems for the first time, because indeed there's fuel buildup at times. So you want to be a little bit more ginger initially, and over time, as you condition that site to burning, you can be a little bit more aggressive in that regard. Again, once you knock back these mesophytes, get that out of the equation, wait for that mass, you're going to have a pulse of oak regeneration. Hopefully, that's when you pull back fire. Now you have to wait some time, and that's what you're getting at here. So what is the length of time before these oak seedlings develop into saplings and saplings into poles. And it's really that transition into pole size when individuals are about 4 to 5 inches where they start armoring themselves and they're protected from fire. Some will get injured still, but oftentimes they're able to live through it. So what is that length of time? Generally saying, I'm talking 10 to 12 years between getting a pulse of regeneration to getting those trees up to a size by which they can withstand fire.
Thanks,
And
Greg.
it also is predicated on site conditions, site productivity. Higher productivity sites, trees grow faster, so that length of time might be shorter versus infertile dry sites.
Great. We're running short on time, but I've got 2 last questions I want to pose to you. One is, do you have any good reference material on oak forest pre-settlement conditions and Native American forest management practices? And then second, how about any resources for private landowners today to be managing their oak forests?
Regarding the last question, I think the booklet that you just had, Mike, Mike, is a good one for not only public land management, but private land management. So I just can point to that booklet that you had at the beginning of your introduction. Yeah, there's gobs of literature out there documenting pre-settlement forests. I remember putting together a database quite some time ago that had over 500 references documenting pre-settlement conditions. So there's a plethora out there. The things that I find most interesting is really these comparison studies, what was here in the past, but what's here now, and what type of changes have taken place. So yeah, there's a vast literature out there. And for that individual or set of individuals that are interested, again, have them contact me and I can shuttle at least a few of them their way.
Great, sounds good, Greg. I'll try to get your email directly into the Q&A box for that person. But Greg, thank you very much. Appreciate the presentation. Hope you can stay on, and hopefully we'll have some time to come back and answer some more questions at the end. But at this point, we're going to transition to Callie Schweitzer, who is a research forester with the Forest Service. And Callie, thank you so much for joining us today. Take it away. The floor is yours.
All right. Good afternoon, everybody. I am going to turn my video off. I'm not sure if you can see me or not. For those of you who've done Zoom presentations, it's a little odd setup. Just hoping that we don't get cut off here. So I am Callie Schweitzer. I'm a research forester. I'm actually located in Huntsville, Alabama. And I pretty much have spent my career looking at applied hardwood silviculture across the central hardwoods region. And I've done a lot of studies that have resulted in giving us some information about how to regenerate oak. So I think it's just really exciting that all of a sudden we have entities that are super interested in oak regeneration. And so I don't have a whole lot of time, so I'm going to just go through a couple slides and talk a little bit about managing today's forest for tomorrow's oaks. And I think this piggybacks well off of Dr. Nowacki's work in that at the end, I have a few slides on fire. I may not have enough time, but we could go to the discussion. So I appreciate him covering that. So if you're wondering why it's not a fire talk, it's because Dr. Nowacki was covering that part. And I'm not being able to forward my slides after all of that. All right, sorry. Trying again. Sorry, I'm not able to go forward.
No worries. Do the arrow keys work to advance the slides for you?
Nothing is working. Oh, there we go.
Now it's advancing. You're all set.
Right, I got it. Okay, so I wanted to start with this slide, and I apologize up front. Those of us in research like to show some data slides. So I have pictures and data interspersed, but just sort of to set the stage. And so what you're looking at here is a graph of stand age of, this happens to be for white oak. This was done with some collaborators who use FIA data to look at some of the white oak resources in the central hardwoods region. And so on the y-axis going up and down, you have acres of white oak forest type. And on the x-axis, you have the age of those white oak forest types. And this would hold true whether you're looking at white oak forest types or red oak forest types. This is really what our age distribution looks like. And I just want to draw your attention to this. These are our young trees, 0 to 20 years old. This is the whole, today's whole session is sort of predicated on, this is our problem. We don't have a lot of young acres of this forest type out here. And remember, these are ages, and so as these grow older, you're not going to get taller. So these 0 to 20-year-old cohort is essentially missing, and this is part of our consternation. But on the very positive side, where I think that we're catching this maybe ahead of the downfall, is if we look at this age class here, this cohort, this is the older cohort, and there are plenty of them out there. So we're not yet in dire straits with regard to the oak regeneration problem. So we already heard this word once, the oak bottleneck, and I'm going to talk about it again. It's always good when your colleagues and you are on the same page. And so, we talk about this oak regeneration problem, and I like to say we have an oak recruitment problem. And the reason for this is that we have plenty of mature trees that we talked about. We have lots of moms and dads out there. They are making plenty of acorns. You can see those acorns readily germinate. People do talk about, there are places where germination could be an issue, but for the most part, we have lots of acorns that fall to the ground and they germinate. The problem is they don't get to that size class that my colleague Ryan is hanging on to. So this larger young oak sapling, is the biggest we can get them is great. If we can get them to 6 feet tall, that's terrific. Over an inch in diameter, that's really good. And what the graphic is showing you, and this was done years and years ago, is that in the size distribution of these in any given stand. So just that same message being again. So the orange is the oaks, and you can see at the end there, it's like the bottom on the side. Lots of mom and dad oaks, and they are making progeny. We have lots of acorns and seedlings out there. That was on the left-hand side, but that squeeze in the middle are the oaks that we're missing. And in this slide in particular, it's being squeezed by those maples. But as Dr. Nowacki talked about, a lot of those mesophytic species. So if your stand looks like either of these and you want to regenerate oak, you might be 2 years too late. And the reason for that is if you have oak in the overstory and you want to regenerate oak, you have to start the process of regeneration at least 10 years before final harvest. Oaks are advanced growth dependent. That means that they have to be there prior to the disturbance, and they have to persist through the disturbance. And there has been probably almost 100 years of research on this. And the take home is that numbers and size matter. And the more and larger oak reproduction you have out there, the better. So it's really site dependent, it's forest dependent, it's disturbance dependent, but just the more and the larger are the better. So we have good acorn crops and we have lots of seedlings. You guys have all seen this out there in the forest. So what happens to them? So just real quickly, in general terms, we're going to look at survival and height of those acorn germinates. So this is survival on Y years after establishment. So as we talked about mass years, acorns are always, oak trees are almost always producing some acorns, especially when you have a fully stocked oak stand. You get some type of survival at year 1. It drops down to about maybe 60%. And then over time, that cohort of new germinates drops down to survival about 10%. And if we look at the height growth of those germinates, they grow to about a foot tall and they just hang in there. And some of them can hang in there for a long time and some of them can respond, but a lot of them hit their demise after a while of just hanging in there at a foot tall. So what do we want to do? What we want to do is we want to manipulate the stand by reducing either the basal area or the stand density in order to move those curves to the right. So the pink is just moving that survival curve to the right. So that same cohort under some type of reduced stand density, again, changing those understory conditions. And then, of course, we really also want not only for more to survive, but for those that survive to have greater height growth. So we know one way of doing this is to manipulate the light levels in the understory. And that is sort of what the emphasis on most of the research looking at oak reproduction is doing. So we know that low light levels reduce the survival of oak seedlings and prevent the accumulation of large advanced reproduction. However, as foresters, we're really not sun gods, but we are trying very hard to manipulate the amount of sun or light that gets into the understory. In a lot of systems, if you have too much light, you open the stand up too much, you're going to get anything that's very shade intolerant that loves the light, such as yellow poplar, birch. There's plenty of other ones. If you have too much shade, if you don't open up enough, and Dr. Nowacki hit on this as well, you get very shade intolerant species. Sugar maple is a great example of that. And if you get just the right amount of light in that understory, you can promote the growth of oak and recruit it into these larger positions. So we also have discussed the mesification hypothesis. Our contemporary forests in the East are very different than what they were 80, even 60 years ago. The mesification hypothesis has proven this true, and that these shade tolerant mesophytic species such as maples are replacing shade intolerant fire adapted species, perhaps oak. But I like to argue that not just fire adapted, but also disturbance adapted species, especially for upland oak. So we have greatly altered our disturbance regime, not only with harvesting and fire, but also grazing, insect and disease, the weather, climate, and so forth. So this change in our disturbance over the past 60 years has really changed these understory conditions, and has led to the shift away from having more dominant oak in our system. So what do we need? We need active management. At this point, we need to put those disturbances back in these systems. We need to try to move these understory conditions from being cool and shady and wet and mesic to being dry and more open and more sunny or more xeric. And we can do that as silviculturists using regeneration treatments. We can do that using both clear cut and shelter wood. And I want to give you a glimpse into some of the work that we've tried to do using those treatments. So for those of you who aren't aware of what a shelter wood method is, it's basically a regeneration prescription that's advocated for regenerating oaks. It's a way to control light and competition in the understory prior to removal of the overstory. So you're creating understory light conditions to promote these small oaks to grow or recruit into these larger size classes. There's a lot of semantics around it. You can have one phase, two phases. You can have phases with pending. I don't care what you call it. I would like us to think about reducing stand density to recruit these oaks. And then when we get them into the numbers and sizes that we think are viable, to release them in some type of final harvest in order to capture the legacy of the mom and dad trees that are out there right now. So we implemented what was generically called an oak shelter wood. And this was advocated by several people, names if I said you would probably recognize. And basically the oak shelter wood was done to get rid of the mid-story in particular to grow advanced oak into a more competitive position. And this shelter wood in particular is non-commercial. It's done using an herbicide. So you get rid of the mid-story with an herbicide, you create growing space in the herbicide. And what you're trying to do is increase light enough for the oak to recruit, but you don't want to open it up so much that shade intolerance will respond. And then once again, the oaks are in this competitive position and have recruited, you go in and you remove the overstory. So this is what one of those look like. This is a mid-story reduction with an herbicide. Hundreds of small stems in the mid-story were reduced in this treatment. We also did a harvest shelter wood. So we started out with stands that had about 120 square feet of basal area. We took them down in a commercial harvest to about 30 or 40 square feet of basal area. That was the initial treatment. We let it grow for 10 years, and then we removed the rest of the merchantable trees after that time period. And finally, we did a commercial clear cut, which we started with about 110 square feet of basal area. And we did this commercially, so there was about 5 square feet of basal area left out there, but essentially all the merchantable trees were removed. So I'm going to show a couple data slides now, and I just want to preface it by saying for the 75% retention, that's that oak shelter wood, that's that herbicide treatment. So our goal was to remove a small proportion of the basal area and retain 75% of the basal area, which is the reason for that terminology. So this is a graphic showing how we did with our light. So we have these little fancy instruments called septometers where we can actually measure photosynthetically active radiation. So on the y-axis is the percent full sunlight, and on the x-axis is sort of a timeline of the study, of the initial part of this study. So the yellow line you see is this 20% value. So our literature tells us that if we can get the understory light up to about 20% of full sunlight, that will promote oak without promoting shade tolerant or shade intolerant species. So sort of a magical number to shoot for. And then I have the three treatments that I talked about. So let's talk about the clear cut first. It's the green bar. So the black dashed line is the initial treatment. So that's when it was clear cut. And then the red dashed line is when a second treatment was done. But for the clear cut, there was no second treatment done. We only clear cut it once. Wasn't enough volume out there to treat it again. So you can see, you open the stand up. At 10 years, we had light levels in the understory that were far above that 20%, but then after about 10 years or so, we dropped below that level. If we look at the 25% retention, remember there were two commercial harvests. So the first one you can see it sort of undulates, it goes up and down. So we cut it, it sprouted. There was a lot of dense sprouts out there. Stand density reduction happened just naturally. We dropped down, we got real shaded in 2005. And we had a little bit of mortality of some of those sprouts. So we had another little pulse of light in there. And then in 2010, we did a second harvest, and you can see we got way above that red line at that time. And then for the 75% retention, remember this was specifically to grow oak into these more competitive position. The take home is that we did not open the stand up enough initially to get above that 20% line. Of course, when we removed the overwood in the final harvest, it went way above that. And the reason we didn't get above that 20% line was because in our systems, we have shade tolerant sugar maple. Again, nothing wrong with sugar maple or yellow poplar. We were just trying to increase the stocking of oak in these stands. And so when we reduced that mid-story, these small sugar maples took over. So we started with a stand like this. We got rid of the mid-story. We let it go. We completely removed all merchantable trees in the overstory. And in 2020, this is what that stand looked like. Let me show you just a couple more little quick data slides. So we're going to look at stems per acre. So this was in 2020, so about 10 years after we did the final harvest. On the x-axis are the seedling sizes. So the smallest ones are on the left. The ones I want you to pay attention to are on the right. These are the largest seedling sizes, so 4 feet tall, up to 1.5 inches DBH, so getting into that sapling size. Oaks are blue, sugar maple are orange, and yellow poplar is yellow. So the take home here, I'm not presenting the initial data, but we had no large oaks. We had no oaks in that large size class at the beginning of this study. We had other small oaks. We had thousands of them that were less than 1 foot tall. So we went from having none to 500. That's a very positive response for us. We also maintained the amount of sugar maple that's in there. And you can see as I've been talking and you've been looking at it, we've almost doubled the amount of yellow poplar. When we did the final harvest on this stand, we opened it up. And because the smaller stems were killed with an herbicide, we had a very sparse sprouting response. So the stand was very open and very shrubby and very sunny, and it allowed new yellow poplar germinates to come in. So that's where we stand with that one. And the second one, we did a commercial harvest, took the basal area down, and then we harvested it again. So this one had 2 commercial harvests. Again, looking at those same data. Again, looking at the year 2020, we went from 5 to 500 large oaks. So again, really super encouraging. But even more encouraging when we look at these data, you can see, although there is a good amount of both sugar maple and yellow poplar, young small saplings out there, the oaks are almost double in terms of their density. And I think the reason for this response was that the growing space in the light post phase 2 was very different. We did not use an herbicide. We had lots of sprouts. And if you remember, we sort of had that undulating light. where we had light and then it got shady and then we had light. And I think that really put a hurting on the yellow poplar that we had out there. And when we opened it up, we had enough shade that it deterred new yellow poplar germinates while allowing these oaks to continue to recruit. Finally, we had a stand that we clear cut. It looked like that, and that's what it looked like in 2020. And that was a picture taken somewhat recently. And suffice to say that we have taken this stand and we had regenerated it to yellow poplar. So even though we went from 10 to 167 large oaks out there, so we did also increase the number of our large oaks. You can see that we have over 450 large yellow poplar out there, and the stand is probably 90% yellow poplar at this time. So with that, I'm just going to have a quick note about fire. Lots of reasons to use fire, and I like Dr. Nowacki's sort of at the end there, ending on a good note, like all of these reasons for restoration and using fire. And we have a lot of questions about using fire as part of the oak regeneration process. Most of our fires in the east are done in the dormant season. These are cool fires that sort of creep along and just consume mostly the year's litter fall. This is a good example of a fire in one of our upland oak systems. And the question is, can we use fire to recruit small oak advanced reproduction in more competitive positions? And that's quite a conundrum these days. So we talked about the need to have these larger oaks in these competitive positions. We've also, both of us, Dr. Wacky and myself, have talked about needing to open these stands up. So I think fire can play a role with a shelter wood or even a thinning. Again, we're coming down to semantics, but opening a stand up. It will take multiple fires to start getting rid of the mid-story versus using an herbicide, sort of a one and done. You're still going to have to probably punch some holes in the overstory. It's not going to be enough. And as Dr. Nowacki alluded to, this sort of robust mesophytic understory of red maple is surprisingly resilient to these fires and has been sprouting back with a vengeance. And so we're still trying to see where's the best way to use fire. Use it before you treat, after you treat, somewhere in that process. So with that, that is some silviculture to regenerate oak in the stands we have today, sort of playing the cards that were dealt with. But what if, just what if, you need even more help with oaks? And my plan here was to just pass this off to Dr. Clark, who is going to help us out with if we get even in a bigger mess.
Excellent. Hey, thanks, Callie. Before we pass the baton to Stacy Clark to take us in the final stretch, there is one specific question here to your presentation regarding that 20% of sunlight to, allow for oaks to regenerate. Does that 20% of full sunlight roughly translate to 80% of canopy cover? Or how does one kind of estimate that 20% sunlight you referred to?
Yeah, again, that's a great question, and that's what the study set out to do. So it's going to be very different. What we were hoping was to give you a prescription, you take it down to 50 BA, and you're going to get 35% of the full sunlight. The problem is that the disturbance in our systems is so different as you move from stand to stand that response is just so variable on the stand that you're working in. If you have a lot of sprouters, if you have a lot of shrubby species, again, we're looking at the understory light levels. So at this point, what I would say that there's nothing magical about the 20%. We're starting to question that as well. The more sun you can get down there, the better. But you need to leave some shade, or you're going to get your shade intolerance come in. So it's really sort of playing a game. That's that wood sense that you all need to use to get it to just right. So yeah, I wish I could give you a magic, reduce the basal area. My take home to that is, we are so far behind in treating our stands. We have so many stands out there that need to be treated that the harder you can hit it and make sure that you're getting the response in the understory, the better, because doing a lot of gyrations, coming back and checking and monitoring and doing it again are probably going to be beyond the realm of what most of us can handle.
Great.
Sorry, I didn't have anything more.
No worries. Thank you, Callie. Let's transition to Dr. Stacy Clark, and then we'll circle back at the end for a few more general questions. But Stacy, the floor is yours. We see your presentation. Go ahead and take it away.
All right, thank you. I really appreciate you inviting me today in the Michigan SAF group. Also, I really appreciate being here. I'm going to stop my video because it keeps freezing on me. So I put it on there for just a second to say hello. But I am going to talk to you today about planting oak, and just a little background on myself. I am a research forester with U.S. Forest Service Southern Research Station, and I'm located in Knoxville, Tennessee. And I predominantly study artificial regeneration of upland oak species, but also do a lot of work with restoration of the American chestnut. But today I'm really concentrating on oak. So let's see if I can get this to presenter view. There we go. And I do want to say that I do a lot of work with the University of Tennessee tree improvement program here in Knoxville. They run probably the oldest hardwood tree improvement program that exists, maybe other than the one at Purdue. So just to begin, there are a lot of benefits to planting that should be considered when you're making management decisions. First of all, you get an immediate input of advanced reproduction. As Dr. Schweitzer pointed out, that's necessary for regenerating oak species. There's a couple other things that are good though. You get possible genetic improvement. We've seen some of this with Dr. Schlarbaum's work at the University of Tennessee. There are cost share programs available that can help facilitate the planting and offset some costs that landowners may have. And when you're in the public realm, like I am, a lot of people like the idea of planting because the public likes it. And so it is often not challenged or questioned in terms of as a management practice. As Dr. Schweitzer pointed out, the first law of oak silviculture is that you have to have this large competitive advanced oak reproduction at the time of the overstory removal or disturbance in order for that, for those oaks to be competitive. And what we're talking about there is generally trees need to be, between 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 feet tall at the time of the disturbance. And that's really difficult to get. And that's where the bottleneck comes in. So planting is a tool that you can use. It's an option that you can conduct to reduce that time needed to get that advanced oak reproduction and immediately input that into your site. And I just want to give a little background. There's been planting going on for decades. And actually, in the United States, we've been planting for, probably thousands of years. But when it comes to oaks, it's largely undomesticated. It's not like pine. Everything is more difficult. And, I've been studying this my whole career, and people before me have been studying it, and we still have a lot to learn. But starting in the 70s, there was a lot of work that really kind of geared up with Oak Symposium proceedings. That, in a large part of that, was related to planting. We used to have these workshops on seedling physiology and growth problems in oak plantings that went on for a couple of decades. We don't have them anymore. Maybe we need to bring them back. And then in 1992, there was the seminal meeting in Knoxville on oak regeneration, and there was planting as part of that proceedings and workshop. And unfortunately, there was a lot of stuff that wasn't addressed in this body of work, which revolved a lot around seedling quality. There was a little bit of that, but not really. When you look into that research, a lot of it was more on stock type and not necessarily the quality of the seedlings. And a lot of the research was conducted in the central hardwood region by Paul Johnson's lab in Missouri. And also there was a lot of work in the Lake States, but unfortunately that research program was shut down. But there is a lot of historical literature out there by Techlaw and Icebrands in particular on planting oak seedlings, and most of that's in the 90s. And then moving into the 1990s and 2000s, this is when I came in as a grad student. And so I got to learn from a lot of really important scientists that were doing kind of at the forefront of this work. And in particular, Paul Cormanick and his lab, they were working on nursery protocols to develop seedlings of high quality. And the goal really was to produce a seedling that you could plant and walk away. And not, like as Dr. Schweitzer mentioned, there's not a lot of resources out there for landowners and managers to keep going back to these stands over and over again. So that was really the goal that Dr. Cormanick was trying to get, but to achieve. But it's a very difficult one, and I don't know if it's actually obtainable, but we've gotten closer to it. And then also we added a genetic component at that time because of the maturation of a northern red oak seed orchard on the Cherokee National Forest, which has added a lot of, I think, quality and refinement to our research that other programs don't necessarily have. And then also at that time, we were putting in a lot of progeny tests and silvicultural test plantings. And then in the 2000s through to today, I've really developed my research program with my partners to look at seedling quality coming out of the nursery. And we typically use pedigreed seedlings, so we know the genetics of the seedling, at least the mother tree of the seedling. We've also done research to look at acorn, or in the case of chestnut, American chestnut, sizing. So sizing acorns or chestnuts as they go into the nursery to see if that helps improve seedling quality. We've looked at other nursery practices such as top clipping and root clipping. And then we put that all together and we apply that into silviculturally treated stands and look at their competitive abilities over time. And so this is just a picture. I know you guys are in Michigan and you're never going to get seedlings like this up there, but this is what what you can get in the South and Tennessee and Georgia in particular. These are 1.0 bare root nursery seedlings, so 1 year old. Again, in Michigan, you're not going to get close to that. You would have to grow your seedlings for 2 or 3 years probably. And that was northern red oak. What I'm showing here in this picture is actually white oak, 1.0 white oak seedlings. So the objectives of my research is really to provide practical management solutions to increase the pool of competitive advanced oak reproduction prior to the regeneration treatment. And so throughout the studies, we look at seed source. In other words, where did the seedlings come from in terms of the mother tree? Sometimes we look at the acorns themselves in terms of size and weight. We typically always look at some form of seedling quality, whether that be visually grading the trees or measuring their characteristics, and then planting the trees into different regeneration treatments or different tending treatments. And so I'm going to talk about 3 study sites today. We've got a lot more, but this is the ones I've picked out due to their age and the species that we're studying. So northern red oak is the one we've studied the most, and that's true for all of research in eastern hardwood forest in terms of planting. That's the one species that's been studied the most. White oak has much less research on it. White oak is much harder to deal with, and that's probably why it hasn't been studied as much. But for our northern red oak research, I've got some studies in East Tennessee and Western North Carolina, and the white oak study is in East Tennessee as well. So we use pedigreed seedlings. We grow them using advanced nursery protocols that Paul Cormanick developed, and we plant them into silvicultural treatments. And we feel that the studies have a high degree of research effectiveness. In other words, we're testing the right things in the real world. So the 3 studies, the first one is the oldest study I've put in. It was established in 2007. And for that, it's pretty simple. We're just looking at seedling grade. These were visually graded seedlings conducted by nursery crews. We had nursery run seedlings. Those are seedlings that I would consider, most nurseries would produce. They do cull a little bit of their seedlings, usually less than 10%. And so that was one treatment. And then the other treatment was what we call premium grade. So these are seedlings that represent the top 30 to 40% of seedlings that you would pick out as the highest quality. And we put those into a shelter wood establishment cut that was taken down to about 70 to 80 square feet of basal area. And then we've got a study in 2010 where we were looking at different silvicultural treatments, and we planted only high quality seedlings there, defined as the best 40 to 60% of the trees in the nursery, mainly because that that particular study is on a pretty high quality site. And then the last study is a white oak study where we planted 2 white oak seedlings that were high quality into 2 different types of silvicultural treatments. And then we also looked at a competition control treatment. So the first study is this study on the Royal Blue or the North Cumberland Wildlife Management Area in Tennessee. And again, looking at testing premium grade versus nursery run seedlings. And there's the nursery crew. They're grading out the seedlings for planting. This is what we got after 15 years. Some of the trees are quite large and in competitive positions. Also, we did do a competition control in 2010 and in 19. That was done, not as a treatment to study, but as something that we felt was needed to keep the seedlings in somewhat of a competitive position. And so here's the results. Obviously, the premium grade seedlings did outcompete the nursery run seedlings, and that size advantage they had at the time of planting increased over time. So on average, the premium trees are 3 feet taller than the nursery run seedlings, and survival, however, was not affected at all by the seedling grade. We have about 50% survival, which is not great, but we had a very severe drought in the year of planting that probably killed about 20% of our trees. And in terms of being free to grow, which is just a measure of competitive ability, we have most of them are free to grow after our 2019 release, obviously. And then the second study is this Cold Mountain Gameland study in North Carolina, where it was planted in 2010 using high quality seedlings, pedigreed from different genetic families. But today I'm just going to talk about the silviculture part of that. So we planted into control stands. So those are stands that were not treated. We planted into the mid-story removal stand, which Dr. Schweitzer described quite well. So those stands have not been commercially treated. They were treated to remove the mid-story with herbicide. Then we planted in stands that received prescribed fire. So we planted after a burn, and then they were burned at year 3 and at year 6. And then we have a shelter wood burn, which was harvested down to about 30 square feet of basal area and then burned at year 5 after planting. And so this is a picture here showing the time of planting and a shelter wood burn treatment here. And then this is year 8. This is the site 8 years later. And so not surprisingly, the best treatment was the shelter wood burn in terms of survival, 82% after 7 growing seasons. The rest of the treatments had, I would call, relatively low survival, particularly in the control, where there's no sunlight really coming to the forest floor, so the seedlings are dying. The mid-story removal did bump up that survival a little bit from the control, and the prescribed burn also is holding in there at 50%. But really, the commercial harvest was the only viable treatment. However, when it was burned, that negatively affected the height and the survival of those seedlings. It reduced height by 6.5 feet compared to trees that escaped fire or didn't get burned over. So fire in this sense was negative for our seedlings at year 5 after planting. So I would recommend waiting longer before you burn in these types of systems. But this was a study that was put in not just for planting, but for many other reasons. A lot of people were doing other research. So this was just one component of it. The maximum tree height in the shelter wood burn was 22 feet versus 10 feet in the shelter wood burn for trees that actually burned. And then the last study is the Oak Ridge study, and it was planted in 2015, looking at trees that were planted into a shelter wood with reserve treatment versus an expanding gap. And what that looked like was just a gap that was a ½ acre in size, and it has not yet been expanded, although it is actually being expanded now, but the data I'm presenting today are just the initial gaps. And then we did do a competition control in half of those, where we did a pre-harvest herbicide to remove sprout competitors from poplar and red maple, and then a post-harvest herbicide at year 5 to directly release oak seedlings. And those were done, this herbicide treatment was done in single stands. So either the stands either got both of these or they got none of these. And this is a picture, this previous slide is showing you in the shelter wood. This is what the shelter wood stands kind of look like. And then this is the gaps, and this is what a tree planted on the gap edge looks like at year 6. And then the data for survival show that the worst survival was in the gaps, but outside of the gaps. We planted in the gap centers, on the edges of the gaps, and then outside of the gaps. And of course, the trees planted outside the gaps were getting the least amount of sunlight and had the lowest survival rates. The competition control had no effect on survival inside of the shelterwood harvest, but it did affect survival in the gap centers in particular. And it actually decreased survival in the gap centers. And I think the reason there is because of what Dr. Schweitzer talked about earlier, where we reduced all the sprout competitors, and that allowed poplar to seed in extremely thick in those gap centers. And then that created a very negative environment for our planted seedlings, and a lot of them just couldn't hang in there with that poplar competition. So in this case, competition control was really negative in terms of the gap centers trees. It was slightly positive on the gap edges though. So there was an interaction there of competition control and silvicultural treatment. And then in terms of growth, the trees are really doing the best in the shelterwood harvested area. A slight benefit from competition control there. In the gap centers, the trees are doing okay if they had competition control. But again, that competition control reduced survival. So there's a trade-off. You get better growth, but reduce survival if you do competition control in the gap centers. Not much of an effect in terms of height growth on the gap edge, a little bit of an effect of height growth on the outside gaps, but these trees remain small and are getting continually browsed. So really, I don't recommend underplanting in these kind of conditions. So just to wrap things up, for nursery seedling quality, we recommend that you use the top 30 to 50% of your trees. That means you're going to grow a lot of trees you're not going to plant. You can plant those lower quality seedlings in areas that are maybe lower in site quality and don't have as much competition, or areas where you're going to really manage a lot. But that's not generally the case. So I would recommend only planting about 50 to 60% of what you're growing in the nursery on any given year. So you have to account for that when you're dealing with the nursery, paying for more than what you're going to plant. You got to pay your planting crew more because they're going to be planting larger trees and fewer of them. So you got to make all of those considerations. And for the Southern Appalachians, we generally recommend trees of northern red oak need to be 3 to 4 feet tall. I recognize that's not going to be possible for you in Michigan or the northern lake states. You're going to need to talk to your nursery about this and see how big you can get your trees and talk about, the length of growing in the nursery that you need to do. But, you want to get your seedlings basically as big as you can get them. Quality is going to vary year to year in your nursery, depending on where you plant in the nursery, and also just it's affected by weather and climate and things like that. And in terms of competition control, the post-harvest competition control, I didn't get into this too much, but it was beneficial, but the pre-harvest competition control does not appear to be that beneficial. But I want to make a caveat to that. This is the least studied aspect of oak planting. And so we don't have as much data as we want. In terms of silviculture, the trees did best where you had commercial harvesting and you had some residual overstory. Those gap centers where you had no residual overstory, the trees got outcompeted very quickly. But they need sunlight. They need some amount of overstory disturbance in order to survive. The gap edges are an interesting part of this, and maybe in the future, as we expand these gaps, those might be a good place to put oaks, or that oaks will develop over time, but we just don't have the answers right now. I do not recommend planting in areas where you're going to burn for at least 8 or 9 years. Planting will kill some of your, or prescribed fire will kill some of your planted trees, and it will also stunt their growth. Underplanting and non-commercial stands is also not beneficial. I know some people really want to do this. The only time I think it might be beneficial is if you have pine stands where you've got that filtered sunlight coming in, and maybe that would be a good place to plant them. Start ahead of, don't wait until the year you want to plant trees and try to find seedlings. That's not, you're not going to be able to do it. You got to start about 1.5 years ahead of your planting job. Make sure you've got seed sources that are locally adapted. That matters. Nurseries will buy seed from wherever they can get it in bad years. and you might be planting seed from Virginia and Michigan if you don't ask these kind of questions. Seed source matters, genetics matter in every single study we've ever put out. So make sure you get the answers to that by developing a relationship with your nursery. This is particularly important for white oak, as white oak is like a fruit. It does not last very long in the cooler, and so you want to get those sowed as soon as possible after collection. And time the planting with the regeneration treatment as best you can. This will help pay for the planting and herbicide costs as well. And I got a whole bunch of references I can send people. And we do have the synthesis publication. It's geared towards southern plantings, but I think it would be of interest to some of you as well. Some of the procedures and protocols are going to be similar. And so that's available. We just hot off the press came out with a video on YouTube on how to collect your own acorns. We're hoping to do a series of these videos on acorn collection, and then we're going to have one on nursery seedling quality, and then one on planting, hopefully by summer of 2023. And then I've got other publications. You can look me up online and get access to all of these. And we've got, if you're interested in chestnut, we've got chestnut videos 1 and 2 that are currently on YouTube. And we've got an online chestnut course that anybody can take and download, and it gives you all the information you could ever want to know about the American chestnut. So I think I'm a little bit over time, but I appreciate all of y'all listening to my talk. And if you have any questions, here's a nice picture of a 200-year-old white oak on the Daniel Boone National Forest in Kentucky while you're thinking about what questions you might want to ask.
Thanks, Stacy. Yeah, we've got a couple of questions in here specific to your presentation. We're running up on our 4:30 hour. If folks need to drop off, that's fine. We're going to take an extra 5 minutes and answer some of these questions. So you're welcome to stay on if you can. First question here was some of the logistics of planting a 3 to 4 foot oak seedling. How do you actually go about planting such a large seedling in the field? The question, I'm assuming you're not using a dibble bar for that. Are you doing root pruning? How are you getting such a large seedling in the ground physically?
Yeah, that's a really, really good question. That's one I get probably most often. So we do prune our roots. And if you're going to do that, don't let your planting crew do it unless they're highly supervised, because they'll just cut all the roots off. We generally prune the roots to 6 inches from the main taproot to get them in the ground. We use a KBC bar that we pay someone to weld, and I can send you the specs. It's pretty easy. You just weld a little bit onto the sides of the KBC bar to make it a little wider to facilitate the planting of those root systems. It works really well with northern red oak. White oak is a little more challenging because the white oak root systems, even though the seedlings are smaller, the root systems are bigger and they're just more challenging. So you might have to go to an auger. If you can get an auger, use it, especially if it's a machine or a tractor mounted auger. We've used machine handheld augers. They're really rough sometimes, but in some conditions that works okay. We've also used planting shovels to get in particular the white oaks in the ground. That is a challenge. And so you have to think about how are you going to pay the crew, really concentrate, target your areas where you're going to plant your trees. Don't just plant across 30 acres. Go out there and say, I want to plant here on this little half acre and over here in this other little quarter acre, and be very targeted.
Great. Thanks, Stacy. We've got a couple of other general questions here that I want to throw out to both Callie and Stacy and Greg. One question was regarding, are there alternatives to fire? One landowner was doing a lot of active management and then also using goats for vegetation management. Is it possible to use goats or other forms of mechanical or other types of treatments as a replacement to fire, or is fire really an essential part of the management tools?
I think I can jump in and answer this question just because we've had an experiment going on in the Mark Twain National Forest using goats. And the answer to that is yes. Goats eat everything, right? So if you're having problems with a plethora of mixed mesophytic species popping up and thickets of rubus and poison ivy or whatever, these guys will eradicate everything, allowing you to start from scratch. So that is an alternative, and it has been mentioned with the other presentations, herbicide treatments. If you're cutting stems, again, they're going to resprout. So dabbing them with herbicide is very important, but I know for some, they don't like to go that route.
Great, thanks. Let's see. I think we're running out of time here, and we're starting to lose more folks on the call. Again, I want to say thank you very much to Dr. Schweitzer and Dr. Clark and Dr. Nowacki for your presentations today. I really appreciate it. Taylor Tibbles from the American Forest Foundation was on the call today, and she wanted to point out that there are several upcoming fact sheets available that are designed for landowners to implement some of these concepts and to help a landowner work with their forester and a logger in their region to apply some of these concepts on their lands. There was quite a few questions that we weren't able to get to that were really focused on that question there. How do we apply this, at a, smaller landscape scale with, 40 to a couple of hundred acres? And so it looks like the White Oak Initiative at the national level is about to come out with some resources very soon that are really targeted towards landowners, and that will be available at whiteoakinitiative.org shortly. Just want to point out again that this is the first in a series of 5 webinars, and we're going to be back here again next month on December 7 to learn more about insects and diseases of oak. And thank you everyone that joined us today. We will get this recording up and available at michigansaf.org shortly. I will be turning in the participant list to the Society of American Foresters, so all foresters will automatically get their CFEs that they're looking for with SAF. And again, thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. Have a great afternoon, everyone.
Thanks, Mike.
Thanks, Mike.
Appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank you so much, everyone, for presenting today.